I'd like to take this opportunity to call the December 15th, 2020 Zoom School Building Committee meeting to order. And I believe our first order of business would be to consider and approve the November 17th, 2020 meeting minutes. So if you could take a moment to consider that. And within a moment or two, I would take a motion to approve the minutes.
I'd move to approve the minutes.
Very good. We have a motion by Ms. Lawson. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second by Mrs. Gallivan. I'll poll the committee. If we could, Dr. Goff.
Yes.
Ms. Gallivan.
Yes.
Ms. Lawson.
Yes.
Mr. Fisher.
Yes.
Mr. Jeffrey Fisher.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mr. Senek.
Yes.
Ms. Gaositz.
Yes.
Ms. Santiago Taylor.
Yes.
Mr. Jack Fisher.
Yes.
Mr. Conroy.
Yep.
Mr. Anderson.
Yes.
Mr. Salvatore.
Yes.
And I'm not sure who I'm missing. There's somebody calling in a phone, and I don't know who that is on the Zoom. Am I missing somebody here? Zoom is kind of inconvenient as far as that goes. Well, I'm going to say it is a vote. Thank you. Our next order of business would be the decision on project enrollment. And we'd like to speak to the school committee update on consolidation. I could certainly speak to that, but Ms. Gallivan and Ms. Gaositz, if you want to speak as well, I would yield the floor to you.
Why don't you start, Mark?
Okay, very good. So the school committee met the other day, last Thursday, and we spoke to the issue of the various options before us. If you recall, this committee last time sort of boiled down the options to a representative sample. I think that's how I phrased it last time. Whether it be consideration of just a Bird Middle School project, a renovation or a rebuilding of Bird, or a combined middle school project, either on the Bird site or the Johnson site. And the school committee voted the other night to narrow it down somewhat to a combined option, which I'm sure doesn't surprise any of you. And again, I spoke very briefly to my belief that a combined option made the most sense financially. And again, what my issue was, I tend to look at it just in terms of dollars and cents. And there's certainly many more considerations, but dollars and cents is certainly, at the forefront. So the thing that I spoke to was that if we were to consider building a new Bird and then a new Johnson, even if we could build them back to back, the cost of two middle schools would be greater than the cost of one combined middle school. And again, certainly there's more to it than dollars and cents, but that's what I spoke to. And that's something that I believe in pretty strongly, frankly. I don't speak up very strongly about very, very many issues at school committee. But when it comes to dollars and cents, that tends to be where I look. Ms. Gallivan, Ms. Gaositz, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, for me, the issue had to do with equity. I had a very hard time thinking about fixing the issues for one side of town. And then, as I said, I feel like I've been on school committee now 9 years, and we've been talking about doing something even before I got on school committee. So that was 10 years. So I can only imagine, how long it would be before we would remedy the situation for the other half of town. And, just educationally, it would be better. You'd have economies of scale, so certain scheduling classes that may be an issue in one school, you could combine. I think it would be more opportunities for students in terms of classes and activities also. So those were the main reasons. And I also thought that I was surprised at how much support the idea for a consolidated school got. And the only real concerns we heard was, it's going to be a bigger school. And I really do think that can be remedied by having houses or, the pods And a lot of the schools that we toured handled it in that way. And it just really did have a feeling of a smaller environment in a big school. So I'm less worried about that than the equity piece of things. And as Mark mentioned, the financial ramifications also came into play for me. That's it for me.
Thank you, Ms. Galos. It's Ms. Gallivan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, similar to what Mark and Jen had to say, I had a bias from the start because I suspected that financially there was going to be a value in combining. But I think we all felt the responsibility to look at it separately from an educational and a social and mental health kind of point of view. I think that from an educational point of view, having more classes happening at a grade level gives you more and flexible options in terms of what you offer. I think that it also means that for kids who have particular interests, there's a better likelihood that there will be enough kids similarly who might be interested in doing the after school club or the extracurricular that they're interested in. And from the social emotional point of view, I was impressed with how many parents of young kids we heard from. We heard from both sides of town. Clearly, we heard more from the Elm Street and Fisher side of town saying, please don't forget us. But collectively, there was a lot of support for combining for a variety of reasons, and a number of them pointed to the way Dr. Goff explained the ability to take a big school and make it have a smaller school feel, and the educational options that happen when you have the larger pool to create your classes and to create your teams of teachers and things like that. So in the end, it was not a hard decision for me at all.
Thank you, Ms. Gallivan. So this is sort of an important consideration. Does anybody else have any other questions or concerns? Please speak up if we do.
If I may, this is David Salvatore.
Yes, Mr. Salvatore, thank you.
So I have a few questions. So the only document that I saw, there was an original document that accepted the town to the program, and it was said it was for the Bird Middle School, and it made a reference to exploring an opportunity to combine the middle schools. Have we had any subsequent documents that indicate what exactly the school building authority will fund as it relates to the combined middle school? Are they going to be funding for both populations or just the one population? And what documentation or what further information have we received to acknowledge that?
So I could speak to that, or more aptly, perhaps looking at the screen here, Mr. Jarvis, as I understand it, the reimbursement, whichever path we choose to go, so in other words, a combined middle school would be substantially more expensive than just replacing Bird. The state will reimburse us at the same rate. Am I correct?
Yeah, they, per your feasibility study agreement, they authorize you to look at both enrollment paths and have the initial reimbursement rate out there for whatever solution you come up with. Obviously, they'll review the solution that goes in there and they'll apply it against their metrics as far as when you build a school of that size. But yes, they're on board for building a combined school for that enrollment of 905.
Okay, and so there's further indication of that beyond the original acceptance that they're discussing. So the combined middle school needs 50 classrooms and one school needs 25. They're willing to pay for 50 classrooms.
That's correct. So you have a feasibility study agreement, and then once we get beyond, instead of scope and budget, we'll do a project scope and budget agreement, which will be in place with them basically as a draft prior to town meeting. And then once, if town meeting votes to approve this, as the town votes to approve the project and move into the design phase, we'll do a funding agreement with the MSBA, and they'll spell out all of the different funding elements of that project. But yes, they'll be on board for a consolidated school.
But, and I would just add, if I could, there is this interim step we're going through in February, which is the preferred schematic report review. So we will get comments back, but they've confirmed, even in our kickoff meeting, that we have the 2 enrollments to study, and as long as we provide the documentation of the decision-making, that they would fund them along the same, obviously according to the same school MSBA regulations and everything around caps, and that would apply to either enrollment. But we will get a confirmed, decision from them before the town is asked to approve this project. Much before, long before.
Thank you, Mr. Bonfatti. Mr. Salvatore, do you have any additional questions?
Sure. So the document we submitted with all the options in it, does this vote go along with that document, or this is a subsequent process, part of the process?
So we submitted if you mean the preliminary design program, the PDP that we submitted 2 weeks ago?
Yes.
So that document was in response to the MSBA to come up with all the possible or feasible solutions for the different solution strategies, so including both enrollments at the time. So they wanted us to look at the feasibility of doing both paths, correct? And then once you had all of that initial information into them, which includes a study of the existing bird school and some of the site considerations on both sites, and get that preliminary information, this next step is narrowing those options down to get to a preferred solution. And the first step in that process is to make a decision on consolidation. So now that starts to whittle down those options. Obviously, the single school options are now off the table, and we're only looking at consolidated options. And that's what we're going to get into a little more detail tonight.
So basically, all of the renovation options will be gone because of the consolidation vote.
Well, so from the MSBA's perspective, they always want you to look at a base. They call it a base repair renovation to the existing building, meaning you basically repair the building that you have, renovate it, bring it up to code, but you don't increase the size of that building. So obviously, doing that just to the bird is no longer a viable option because you're going for a consolidated enrollment. However, one of the options that we were to study was an addition renovation option. And at the last meeting before we submitted the PDP, we looked at an addition renovation option for both the bird school and an addition renovation option at the Johnson school. And the committee felt that the Johnson addition renovation was not necessarily a viable option. But however, the addition renovation is still one of the options at the bird site, because you could obviously make an addition to the bird school and renovate the bird school that could accommodate a combined enrollment.
Mr. Salvatore, if I might add, again, I've mentioned several times that I teach at King Philip High School, and what Rentham did, or King Philip, I should say, the middle schools in Norfolk, and what they did perhaps 16 years ago was they did just that. They put a pretty substantial addition onto the middle school, effectively built a second small middle school adjacent to the new one, renovated the old one, and that became the new middle school. It was a little bit of a different circumstance because they were anticipating a huge enrollment burst. This was the baby boom echo. And we did something similar at King Philip High School. We essentially built a main new classroom wing, kept the 2 gyms, kept some of the structural steel of the old school, and built around that. So that's a bit extreme. The site at King Philip was pretty flat, but this addition renovation bit is sort of still on the table.
Good, thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments? So I'm going to acknowledge my ignorance here, Mr. Jarvis. Again, perhaps you could help me out here. So we're looking for a vote to endorse the final project enrollment. Just to clarify that, so a project enrollment means effectively an enrollment of 405 students, which is one middle school, 450, pardon me, or a combined middle school of 905. So the project enrollment really speaks to one middle school, just a bird, or a combined middle school. So hopefully people understand that. But then I don't know if there's a technical legal explanation of what the word endorse means.
So all we were looking for tonight is, from the MSBA's perspective, the school committee was the body that would make the decision on the enrollment size. And part of the PDP submission was the local approval and authorization certificate. So it was signed by school committee chair, superintendent, and Mr. Johnson, basically saying to move forward with the PDP submission. Part of them approving the enrollment of 905, there'll be a similar approval form that'll go in as part of the preferred schematic report, the PSR, which is the next deliverable. So there'll be a signed document from the district, basically authorizing and telling the MSBA that the town has authorized to move forward with a consolidated enrollment. So that decision is made by the school committee. That was made on the 10th, December 10th. And what we're looking for tonight is to have the building committee weigh in to make sure that everyone in the building committee or that the building committee also supports that decision, or if there's any concerns or questions. We don't need a formal vote from you. It was just more of a discussion point, or if there's a showstopper type of issue or something with a consolidated school, and that's something we'd want to talk about tonight. But right now the school committee has voted to consolidate the enrollments. They're recommending to move forward with one school from an educational perspective, and we just want to make sure that the building committee is also moving forward with that as well.
And just to again further add, the building committee will need to vote in, what's it, February, Brian?
So at the end of February, when we get to preferred schematic, the building committee will actually vote on that deliverable, just like you did on the PDP. And that deliverable, obviously, at this point now is going to work its way down to one preferred option, which in this case would be a consolidated school. So the building committee will vote on that at the end of February. But right now, the enrollment decision that was made by the school committee on December 10th, we were just, asking the committee if there's any questions or concerns, and basically, put in the minutes that the building committee would endorse that decision by the school committee, allowing us to move into this preferred schematic step where we're able to now look at just the options related to a consolidated school. Obviously, if there's an issue and we're still talking about a single school, we need direction for the designer to move forward in some form or fashion.
Thank you, Mr. Jarvis. Do we have any other questions or comments from the committee? So I don't think that we need a vote then. So no. Endorsement is simply acknowledgement that this is the direction the school committee has chosen to go in.
Yeah, and if there's no objections or anything, that's the direction we would head in.
I have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy, if we could.
So, whether we endorse it or however you want to frame it is, we have now decided as a committee that it's going to be one big school. Is that my understanding?
That's correct.
I believe, Mr. Conroy, that the school committee has made that decision, that we're going to pursue one big school, and it's just a matter of this committee being aware of that and or deciding if we disagree with that.
Okay, and at what point would that happen on the disagreement?
Well, it would happen right now if people voiced a disagreement, and or eventually when we vote on the preferred schematic, when we boil it down to one plan, certainly that would be another opportunity.
Well, the issue is that we'd like to advance the options to get down to that one plan, and obviously we're not necessarily moving forward with either a single school or a combined school. I mean, from a time perspective, the preference is to have a path to move forward with, and the goal would be to move forward with one one path and look at the options along those paths. So in this case, you know, as of right now, the consolidated school path was looking at the options along that path.
Okay, so my understanding very simply is the school committee's decided one building and that's the way it's going.
That would be correct, Mr. Conroy, yes.
Okay, so as the building committee went, not necessarily looking at all options, we are just taking, I'll say it, our marching orders from the school committee.
As far as the decision on enrollment, whether it be one 450 student middle school or a combined middle school, I don't know that I would use the word marching orders, but again, the school committee is the decider, so to speak. It's just a matter of this committee making its voice be heard.
Okay. Well, I just want to throw out everything because I've been doing this a long time, and the building committee in the past years has made recommendations based upon what works the best, works most financially, and the school committee was not necessarily, had no real say in it other than, you know, what they needed. So now we have a situation where the school committee is now has the say. That's the way I understand it.
So I understand what you're saying, Jack, but what happened is the school committee is they were voting on the enrollment. So the MSBA wants to see that the school committee has looked at the two possible enrollment sizes and made a decision on which enrollment size they think would be the best path forward from them educationally. And so they made that decision. That decision is being put before this committee. This committee ultimately votes on the decision that goes to the MSBA, which is supposed to go to the MSBA at the end of February. However, to get to that timeline and to meet that schedule, the concepts on the table, which initially included both single schools and a combined school based on the enrollments, have to get whittled down to one option. Obviously, to move forward to get to one option, a decision need to be made on what enrollment you wanted to pursue. So the school committee has voted that one enrollment, a combined enrollment, would make the most sense from them educationally. And then this committee, you know, barring any objections, will move forward, but ultimately this committee will vote on what option is, you know, chosen to be the preferred option and then advanced in the design phase.
So I think, Mr. Conroy, if I might add, I think the difference here between the elementary projects and the high school project many years ago, in terms of the building committee and the school committee, is that extra step as to whether it's going to be just Bird Middle School or a combined middle school. That's an important extra step that we have in this project that we didn't have in the others, and that is in the hands of the school committee.
Yeah. I mean, the other option is if you want, you just have this committee vote on whether to move forward or not. And if there's an issue with consolidated option, then we'll have to address that and figure out what that does. I mean, obviously we're not going to be able to stick to the current schedule that we're on if we have to go back and re-examine that. But I mean, if you want to have a formal vote to put in the record, you could do that. It's just not required by the MSBA to have a school committee vote on the enrollment.
No, I understand. It's just that when I get on all these presentations is maybe I was mistaken. I thought one option was to do the Bird and that would be it. Mm-hmm. But I guess we have to do it all because that's what's being said.
We have to do one. We have to choose a project to move forward.
No. My point was I was under the impression that Bird was the only one in play, meaning that they were going to do something, whether you need additions or renovations. That Johnson was just going to be there and nothing happened to it. But now what I see is we are doing it for the entire enrollment. Is that correct?
That's correct. All right. Yes, Ms. Lawson, if you could, please.
May I speak? I think that in the meetings I've attended, it was clear that one option was to just do Bird, in which case we would just worry about Johnson some other time. And the other option was to do a consolidated project so that both schools could be addressed. And I know in the last meeting I spoke up to endorse a consolidated option because I think that, as has been mentioned before, the idea of just leaving Johnson out would create, would be a nightmare, frankly. And I can't imagine that we would be able to have two overrides, one following the other. Moreover, as also was mentioned, it economically makes sense to do consolidated option. But primarily, I think what I wanted to say to Jack is that the reason the school committee takes the lead here is because it's an educational decision. Whether or not it makes sense educationally to combine and have 905 students in one location is an educational decision, and I think it's properly before the school committee. Having said all that, I think it's cleaner and more, would be a more positive way to move forward, to poll everybody who's present right now, so that we don't later on get accused of, well, you know, this committee wasn't for it, but we were like forced into it. I think that, you know, we should try to be all of a piece here and all together. I personally am endorsing the consolidated option. I think it makes sense, as virtually every other community of a similar size has already done. There's one middle school. And I think that education can address the routines. Children will not be thrown to the wolves in this huge population. I think that's been addressed by the school committee. Financially, I think this is makes a lot of sense. And frankly, I just don't see how we do Bird and not address Jennifer. And I think that would create terrible, terrible feelings in the community for those kids who are going to Johnson. So frankly, I'm endorsing this project as a consolidated option, and I think we should poll the rest of the committee.
Thank you, Ms. Laws.
Jeff Fisher had his hand up, so.
Oh, okay. Mr. Fisher, if you could.
Yeah, normally I would have taken the time to actually view the school committee meeting from last week, but it was about 2 hours long. I didn't quite have that time. Was there any discussion or the decision being made that was made by the school committee in that vote? I just want to make sure that there was no predisposition of where exactly the location was going to be, because as we saw the numbers, there was some favorability on possibly a combined at Johnson versus Bird, simply because of logistics, and you know it looked cleaner. But I just want to make sure that nobody's taking location off the table with a combined decision.
If I could speak to that, Mr. Fisher, from my vantage point, no. You know, I don't have any more information as a member of the school committee than you do in terms of a preferred site. So I would think that, and again, the legality of it, I would think that is something that is the purview of this committee, as well as the school committee going forward.
Yeah, Mark, I'll add to that. Jeff, that is correct. So the school committee voted strictly on the enrollment size based on the educational needs. Citing and anything associated with the project moving forward is under the purview of this committee. It's actually something we're going to start talking about tonight. So, I mean, the school committee in theory votes for the enrollment that they want. If we end up doing a consolidated school, this committee is going to dictate, you know, what site is ultimately chosen, what option is chosen, you know, and there's members of the school committee on the board for that reason.
And one last question, if I may, is, even with this vote, is it still, the MSBA can still come back and say, you know what, are we stuck with the 905, or could they possibly come back and say, you know what, financially speaking and just logistically, we're only going to support a one building site or one school, you know, not a combined site?
No.
Mr. Fisher, I would add, just anecdotally, so we went in last year to a couple of MSBA meetings, and I forget whom the person was, basically inferred that they prefer a combined school rather than us build just a Bird and come back for a great deal more money for a Johnson a few years after the fact. That seems to be, you know, the term that we use is economies of scale. They don't tell us we have to do that. But you know, that seems to be an sort of an unofficial preference. So does anybody have any other questions or comments? And after that, Ms. Galvin, I'll get you in a moment, then I'll take a motion to poll the committee. Ms. Galvin.
I just wanted to add that if you are going to poll the committee, everybody should know that there was a financial analysis done that is part of the presentation that Compass did on, it was November 24th, and I believe it has been, was talked about at the last school building committee meeting. So, you know, the bottom line is, if we were to just do the bird side only, as a school committee, we'd be advocating to very quickly address the Johnson side of town. And I thought that Compass did a pretty good job of analyzing the finances of it. I shouldn't say a pretty good job. I think you did a very good job.
Thank you, Ms. Galvin. Do we have any other questions or comments? Ms. Lawson, would you like to make a motion?
Yes, I would move for favorable consideration of the consolidated option.
Thank you, Ms. Lawson. I'm going to poll the committee, just in the order that you're on my screen. Dr. Goff?
Yes.
I vote yes as well. Ms. Gallivan?
Yes.
Ms. Lawson?
Yes.
Mr. Jeffrey Fisher?
I'm just going to speak freely here. I feel that I should abstain, and the reason being is I'm on this committee as a representative member of the Permanent Building Committee, and I really can't speak to the educational plan.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Senek?
Yes.
Mr. Jack Fisher?
Yes.
Mr. Hahn?
Yes.
Ms. Santiago Taylor?
Yes.
Ms. Gaositz?
Yes.
Mr. Frisha?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
I'm going to not vote on this.
Non-voting.
Okay, very good. Mr. Conroy?
Abstain.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
And Mr. Salvatore?
Mike, did you go?
No.
Very good. And again, there's somebody here on a phone. I can't see who that is. I just want to make sure I'm not denying somebody a vote.
Mark, that might be Donnie Anderson. Donnie, is that you?
Yeah, probably.
Okay, very good.
I'm on the screen, but I'm not on the phone.
Okay, very good. So it is a vote. Thank you, everybody. So the next order of business is on the agenda is feasibility study preferred schematic stage design. And so I guess either Mr. Pena or Mr. Jarvis, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. I'll run with this. Thanks, Mark. So just an update. So where we stand. So this is the timeline that we've been looking at the entire project. We've updated the green status bar to just beyond November. We submitted the preliminary design plan at the end of November. That's what the committee voted on at the last meeting. So that is in with the MSBA. We talked with them today. They were reviewing that. We're expecting to see comments back. Hopefully by the start of the week. They said they would have them back before the holidays, and we'll start addressing those at that time. So we are now moving into the PSR stage, which is preferred schematic report, which we alluded to earlier. That is due by the end of February. So right now we've on the calendar 2/26, and that is the stage where we'll narrow down the options to one preferred option, and then we'll submit that to the MSBA in February. So this is the same slide that we've seen. We've updated this. We're now in the yellow box, as we saw on the timeline. We finished evaluating existing conditions. The decision was made on the enrollment by the school committee. We just voted to endorse that at this committee. We'll now move into a more detailed options analysis of the options that are along that consolidated enrollment path, narrow it down to a final evaluation of alternatives, the short list of options, and arrive at a preferred solution. And the goal is to be there by the end of February to submit that package to the MSBA. And along the way, this committee will need to vote on that like it did on the PDP to submit that into the MSBA. And prior to that vote, we also need to vote on, this committee needs to vote on what they feel is the preferred solution so that the design team at TAPE has a chance to do an updated estimate and do some further design work as part of that submission to the MSBA at the end of February. So we're going to target the end of January. We'll get into that at the end of this meeting for a meeting of this committee to kind of vote on a final option. And we'll have to have some interim discussion in between there and possibly an additional meeting or so. So that's where we are. So by the end of February, that'll go into the MSBA. That gets reviewed. There's a facilities assessment committee that meets in April. We'll get an approval by the MSBA on the schematic design in the March-April timeframe, and then we'll move into, we'll get approval by the MSBA on the preferred schematic in the March-April timeframe, move into schematic design late spring, early summer, with the goal of getting a schematic design into the MSBA by the end of summer. And that's where we'll start to pull together all the pieces that we're heading into town meeting next fall. Next slide.
Does anyone have any questions on the process before we keep moving forward?
Yeah, we'll keep updating these slides, so you've seen them, kind of over and over again, to kind of understand where we are and where we're heading. But yeah, if there's any questions, let us know. We already talked about the enrollment decision. So as we move into starting to evaluate the options that are left on the table, and we'll get to those in a minute. We met with the working group last week and started to go through what are some of the criteria that we want to consider when looking at those options and how are we going to stack those options up against one another. I think there was a list of criteria that went out in your meeting information before this meeting, as well as a draft of a color-coded matrix. So the items you see on the left, we had gone through a whole list of items that you see on this page, but the items on the left were the ones that floated to the top for the working group as far as what we felt were most important in trying to determine what was the best option moving forward. Some of the other options or criteria that were considered are on the right. So things on the left, like some of the critical factors, does it support the educational goal? Obviously, you want to make sure that whatever option you're looking at is going to support the program. Total costs of the project, construction costs, as you can see, they're all going to be relatively within the same ballpark construction-wise. Total cost varies a little bit on a variety of factors. How long construction might take, impact to existing school during construction, impact to existing fields during construction. Does it fit into the long-range planning of the town? And does the siting and the building itself allow for future expansion and growth on the site? So you need to come back, in however many years, 20, 30 years down the road, and an addition made sense. Does it set yourself up? Do you have ability to do that on a site? That's just something, that might be advantageous when you're considering the final design. Other things we looked at were connection to the outdoors. Again, the connection of outdoor learning space is very important to the educational program. We didn't feel it was a deciding factor necessarily. We could decide to add that. And other things like site circulation and parking, we'll know more once we get some draft of site plans in the next few weeks. Impact to the abutters or the neighbors of the project. Is one site going to have more impact than another? Is one site going to have more permitting issues than the other? Traffic between the two sites, is that a determining factor? Impact to natural habitats, special site work conditions, like is there a ledge or something like that on a site? I don't think that necessarily applies to these sites. And then community use, is one site more advantageous to possibly a bigger community campus or something of that nature? So the ones on the left are what we put on the draft matrix, but these were all the things that we discussed, and just open it up to the committee if there's something that on this list that you think is important and should be on the matrix, or something that we might not have considered that isn't on this list. We'd like to get your feedback and have a discussion about it.
Brian, this is Jack Fisher.
Yep.
Quick one. I know you went under the special site work conditions. You mentioned ledge, but I would think that that should be something that's over on the left-hand side, because there's some unusual characteristics of both the Johnson and the Bird site in terms of elevations. So I would think that would be that's something that you've really got to take a hard look at. So I would suggest that one be moved over to the left-hand column.
Yeah, we can add something like that. I know that, like on the Bird site, for instance, a couple of different locations have different elevations that we're dealing with. So that could be a criteria. Obviously that increases site costs possibly, and could create some funky layouts with floor plates and things like that when you lay out the building. But yeah, that's something we could add to it.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah, my question, not my question, my comment is permitting, other than conservation, there are no permits because you're exempt.
Yeah, so we didn't put permitting on there simply because,
Oh, you mentioned it, Brian.
yeah, the items on the right were I should say that everything on this list were criteria that we've used on evaluation matrix on other projects, and some of them are more important in other towns and other building projects than others. Like permitting was a huge issue on the Natick project for different sites. They had a lot of conservation, they had a lot of DEP and Army Corps of Engineer issues on a couple sites. So that obviously adds to the complexity of a particular option. So when you're weighing the options, one option might have very little permitting impact. Like I would think the Bird would fall into that category, and even the Johnson up on the hill probably does not have a whole lot of permitting impact because you're far enough away from the wetlands. So in the working group, we felt that permitting wasn't necessarily a major criteria that needed to be considered, as all the options are relatively the same.
Well, in regards to Bird, you do have that little stream and wetlands area that you'll have to deal with. As far as Johnson, you have nothing. I mean, as far as site material, you're never going to get anything better than that ESCA that it's on. So, I mean, that's a home run as Johnson. Bird, a lot more complicated than Johnson would be. But as far as permitting, like I said, probably conservation on Bird and nothing on Johnson.
Yeah, so if you think some of the options on Bird, do you think all the options on Bird would have conservation impacts, or just the ones closer to the property line there where that stream is?
Well, they're going to grab you if you're within 200 feet. So, been down that road many times, and you're going to get somewhat onto that. So,
yeah, we can add it if you think it's major permitting. I mean, if it's just kind of the usual conservation stuff that we go through on most projects, and we can leave it off, but it's whatever the committee thinks.
In reality, where you cited the new school in the Fields area, put it right smack where the little river is. Nice. Couldn't have put it any better, huh?
Well, no, I mean that's something to consider. Is that obviously that location might have an added permitting element to it. So we can add permitting to the matrix.
No, you already have it. I'm just saying. I just wanted to clear it up. You don't have to go through zoning, planning, or any of that stuff. It's all
right. So
Mr. Jeffrey,
site conditions.
Mr. Jeffrey Fisher, I think you had a hand a moment ago.
Yeah, Brian, can you elaborate on where non-reimbursable costs would be included and part of the evaluation for the PSI?
Yeah, we can do that. So basically, the non-reimbursable costs that would be impacted by some of these siting options would be anything that has to do with like swing space, temporary type conditions that you might have to set up as part of the project, and then obviously the more extensive the site work. So if you're talking about not only what you have to do to build the building or the parking lots or the circulation, if you have to then, maybe recreate the fields or something like that nature, and obviously part of the project, you're driving up your site cost. You could drive you over the site cap, and then the things over the cap become ineligible. So the goal on most projects is try to keep your site costs as tight as possible. Now, obviously, towns want to do fields and things like that as part of a project, and they willingly knowingly go over those caps. But that's where your ineligible costs are going to come in. Anything related to temporary type swing spaces, moving, and then the biggest driver is going to be your cost over the site cap. At least at this stage. And once we get into square foot costs and stuff for the building, we'll have to look at that. But right now, at this stage, those are the categories.
Thanks.
Ms. Lawson.
So my question has to do with the Johnson site. Are there issues with wetlands there or wells? It seems to me that I've heard discussion in the past about certain areas of Johnson would be off limits for building. Can you refresh me?
Yeah, and in maybe Chris can hop in a little bit. The site over at Johnson is up on the higher elevation. I believe we're outside of the well zone.
Okay.
And probably far enough back from wetlands setbacks, but we're going to add permit to the matrix anyway, and that'll help. We'll flesh some of that stuff out. It might change, the advantageous level of the Johnson site a little bit once we find out more information. But right now, preliminarily, it doesn't look like it's an impact.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yes, if I may.
Yep, Mr. Salvatore.
A couple of things. First of all, impact to fields. I don't know if those are meant to be in order or not, but I feel that's a minor issue among the issues. Also, I think traffic is going to be a consideration, at least traffic flow. I think while it's not insurmountable, I think the Robbins Road location does create some serious concerns about doubling the amount of traffic in that area. Having, dropped off at Johnson with half the population when we're looking at twice the population. I think the intersections that are on the Robbins Road area are both very dangerous intersections to the main roads. The intersection of Robin to Elm Street, and also the intersection of North Street to Main Street, two of some of the worst intersections in the town at certain parts of the day. So I think those should be part of the consideration, because we're going to have to either do something to control that traffic that's going to be an added cost to the town. And as part, maybe as a subset to the total cost scenario, just talking about total cost versus total cost to the town, or total cost after reimbursements. I think certainly it's a part of the criteria, and I think that captures a lot of the other issues that were being discussed about site plans and all of that, when you look at the costs, versus the reimbursable costs. But I see it's a good list, and I'm sure we will all have our own value, put different values to each of those criteria. But I think I like the Robbins Road site as far as what you're talking about, the financials and the easier way of doing it. But it does create that intersect. Both of those intersections are terrible. One of them the North Street is probably being addressed with the rehabilitation of 1A, but the Elm Street intersection is it's a scary one. So those ought to be considered as well.
Thank you, Mr. Salvatore. Ms. Gallivan, do you have a hand a moment ago?
Yeah, I agree that I think traffic should be one of the criteria that we're, looking at both sides. And I was going to, first of all, I would say I'm in over my head as far as really knowing what I'm talking about here. But I would say something about environmental impact. I don't know enough about the permitting or the things like that, but I've heard people talk about the Johnson site and having concerns from taking down so many trees, or I've heard it from the point of view of something about impervious cover, so that you have to be able to let the groundwater recharge. So I don't know, and that's why I would just put it in a category of environmental concerns. And then Jack brought up something that I didn't know at all about bird. So I think that when we're evaluating, we should do a thorough evaluation. So I would say something about environmental considerations.
Yes, we have the impact to natural habitats. We could kind of do / environment, / environment.
Okay.
If you wanted to do that.
I would suggest we do, because I think we're gonna deal with it at some point along the way. And I'd rather, just factor that in right from the start.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Galvin. Mr. Jarvis, do we have anything else under item 5?
So we'll finalize this list. So what I have from my notes is the adding permitting, adding traffic, adding impact to natural habitats and environment, and then Mr. Fisher's the line with ineligible costs. So maybe we could parse out the options that have potential for the most ineligible costs. Is that what you're looking for, Jeff?
Find the button, yeah.
Okay.
I'm also adding special site work as a
Oh, right, yeah, special site work at the bottom there.
Okay,
Correct.
I have a list: special site work, permitting, traffic, environmental impacts, and potential ineligible costs.
Perfect.
Brian?
Yes, Jack.
There was a study originally before we bought the Christian Life Center, now Elm Street. We were gonna put the elementary school there. So there had been some preliminary stuff done on it. It must be somewhere. I'm sure Mr. Anderson has it right at his fingertips. But there was stuff done before we went over the Elm Street school.
As far as like traffic and everything, Jack?
No, traffic, that's not the issue, no, just site exploration and everything else and site.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant, I got you.
There was some preliminary stuff done by the architect at that time, and then we bought Christian Life Center, and now we have the Elm Street School.
All right, I got it.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy. So if we could move on to item 6, unless there's any objection. So we are to review the project dashboard and to vote on the November vendor invoice packages.
We're gonna hold on that till the end. So what we'll do now is just refresh everybody on the options that are left after we submitted PDP and after the single school options have been removed. So
Yeah, so Mark, sorry about that. So item 5, we kind of had finalize the criteria and then go through the draft of the matrix with everyone.
Okay, very good. That was my question, but I thought, yeah, very good. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
thanks, Mark.
Yeah, so just to refresh everyone's options, so everyone's memory on the options. So with the consolidated path, that eliminated obviously the single site schools, and that left us with, I believe it's 6. So going back through the options quickly, option BR2, which is the add renovation of the existing bird for a consolidated enrollment. This is a phased project where we build a portion of the new school, the classroom wing, which is kind of north on the page, and then be able to shuffle, kids around and do kind of a phased renovation. There's small bump outs to the existing classroom area. Then there's the connection piece between the existing gym and the building that would help to find a new gym and auditorium space. So this is a phased occupied renovation. It also has a temporary classroom scenario where you're shuffling at least a grade at a time out into portable classrooms to work on the building once the new wing is done, or you're shuffling them through the new wing once once that's done. Maybe you can get rid of the temporary classrooms and shuffle them through the new wing. So there is a longer duration to this. Next option. Option B1 is a new school in front of the existing bird to be built in close proximity to it, similar to our Kennedy Middle School project. This has basically brand new construction starting in front, but obviously is going to need some type of temporary circulation and parking during construction, and then it has a phased completion of the final circulation and parking after you tear down the existing bird. This is also showing a bus loop possibly coming in from, or some type of circulation coming in from the East Street side to help with that. But again, it's temporary setup enabling, build the new building, tear down the old building, and then finish the site work. So somewhat of a phased project as well, but you're not constructing the building in phases. Option B.
One before you move.
Yep.
Can you just show your mouse where the existing school is? I'm sorry.
The 2 dotted rectangles, Jeff, kind of
Okay.
in all those new red circles.
Yeah, it's this.
When you said in front, I was thinking East Street.
Oh, sorry. In front,
Really?
meaning in
Like
front of the front
Washington.
entrance. Yeah.
Okay.
The front entrance being on Washington Street. Sorry. All right. So option The next option is B4. So this is a phased construction of the new building. And again, making it clear that the way that these footprints look now, I mean, it could be totally different by the time we get to where we're going. It's just representing the general strategy. And the thought is you would phase the construction of the building. So you'd build a portion of the building in phase 1 and 2, in front of the old building, tear the old building down, and then finish, maybe a gym wing or an auditorium or something like that. Again, doing that similar on a project in Natick right now, and then also finishing the site work. So there'd be some type of temporary site work to get started on the project with circulation routes, because obviously you're building in the drop-off loop now, and then phase construction of the building in 2 phases. You build the main part of the building, you move in, tear down the old building, build the remaining portion of the building after you move in, and then finish the site work and circulation on the existing site. Next option. Option 5 is new construction between the building and Washington Street, so out in front of the new building. We're calling this somewhat of the dumbbell shape, where you have a central academic core space with maybe a cafeteria auditorium on the Washington side that could accommodate a service entry or access road, and then a gym or auditorium or something wing on the side closest to the existing school. This option is meant to kind of play with the elevation change that's in this area right here. There's almost an entire floor higher, closer to Washington Street. So the lower portion of this building closer to the existing bird is actually relatively a 4-story space, and the upper portion is a 3-story space. And similar construction, it might have you're going to have temporary access, temporary parking for teachers, construction roads, build the building, tear down bird, finish the site work in parking lots and circulation. This is also showing some type of circulation from East Street. Maybe that gets done first to accommodate an access and a drop-off loop during construction. So a lot of moving parts as well. Next option. Option 6 represents building on the field, and that can be in general building on the field. This was showing, based on the last meeting with the committee, we showed 2 options. One where we tried to put the building up on the north side of this, or on the upper part of the page, trying to fit the building in there and still maintaining a baseball field down below it. It didn't fit to include a varsity field below it. So moving the building to this side does get the dimensions for a varsity field or a soccer field on the upper side of that page. But as Jack mentioned, now we're maybe along the wetlands there. This obviously is new construction. You're not really impacting the existing circulation to Bird or the existing school. You're obviously impacting fields. And then presumably the field on the upper part of the page would be a recreated baseball field. It would be most likely construction staging or something of that nature during construction. And then you'd have the demolition of Bird, completion of parking lots at the old building, and then reestablishment and reconstruction of the fields after the building was done. So again, multiple phases, but you'd be able to build the building in theory in one phase. And then the last option, I believe, was just in general a new building at Johnson. We had a couple options of a new building up there. It doesn't really matter what the floor plan looks like. It's just in general a new building up on the plateau up there, showing a new building footprint. Possibilities for circulation off of Robbins Road. Again, no phasing associated with this. You basically clear the site and then just start building, and then little or no impact to the existing Johnson School, and no impact to Bird. So those are the options and what we put together for the evaluation matrix, and we'll add the criteria that we talked about tonight to this as we start to step through it. We have the miniature options across the top. So, BR2, the building renovation, the 4 options at Bird, and then the option at Johnson. The criteria that the working group came up with down the left, we'll add the ones that this committee asked to add as well also. And then what we tend to do is try to color code this. We can assign point values if you think it's necessary, but oftentimes the visual of the color code is substantial enough to really start to see what options have maybe more positives than others. And we just took a shot for conversation's sake, kind of initial wag at all of these to kind of get the conversation started, and I'll quickly run through them. So supporting educational goals. So obviously any of the new buildings are going to be built to support the educational program of a consolidated school, so they all go green. The ad reno, for the most part, we think it'll get there. I mean, obviously there might be a couple, tweaks and stuff because it's an ad reno that might just not fit right, but it's still positive. Total costs, these vary based on duration of the project, duration of construction, the amount of swing space, the amount of temporary type costs associated with the projects. Most expensive being the phased project at Bird, because you have such a long duration where you're building, the school in multiple phases and dragging out the construction timeline. The Fields project also, from the initial conceptual concepts, we were including the cost of recreating fields, both on-site and possibly other places in town. And then the Bird site for total project cost was the Johnson site for total project cost was the lowest overall in the conceptual estimates. The construction costs are all relatively similar. Johnson was slightly lower in the estimates. I think this had more to do that the site work at Johnson was actually a little bit less expensive because it didn't, preliminary concepts didn't involve as much earth moving as possibly the Bird sites where you have those elevation changes. The construction cost in the ad reno to the Bird site, to the Bird school, is actually higher than you might expect, which is often the case by the time that you actually do the work and move around the school and have that longer duration. The construction durations, which were on those concepts, again, orange starting to move towards the, a little bit below average. The full renovation of the Bird school in pieces as you're moving kids around, we're saying 3 years. It could take possibly 3 years. And again, it's 3 years until the building is 100% done in its entirety, which is different than maybe the new option where you're building the building in 2 years. And then the final year is, cleaning up the site and doing the parking lots and things like that, but the building is open. The options at Bird, vary between 3 to 3+ years, depending on what you have to do after construction with demo and finishing roads and redoing fields and how long the fields take to establish and those types of things. And then the duration at Johnson could be the quickest. I mean, it could be as quick as 20 months to 24 months, start to finish, and the building is open. Impact to existing schools, obviously, ad reno is a major impact to the existing schools. You're working in the building, you're moving kids around. Phase construction on the Bird site, all of the oranges, that's either you're messing with existing circulation and parking, or you're actually moving kids into temporary classrooms as you're finishing phases of the project. And then the other option where you build on the fields, less impact to the existing school other than the fields, like for gym class, but basically all the other operations are intact, and obviously little or no impact at the Johnson site. Impact to existing fields, the Bird, other than a building on the field, has minimal impact or no impact to the existing fields. Johnson has no impact to the existing fields. And then long range township planning, this is really just, we'd assume that consolidated school fits into town's long range planning as far as from a financial perspective. But I mean, this is something the committee can talk about, of, the pros and cons of each one of these. And then future expansion, the only thought was that the, field, all the options on Bird give you some type of expansion of that building for the most part if you needed to add an addition or something like that way down the road. The field project maybe can fit some more space in there, but you might spill back onto, the new playing field or something of that stage. It might be a little bit, it's kind of average, I guess. And then the Johnson, obviously, you could position the building or design the building in a way that you can easily add an addition. You don't really have any constraints on that site. And then we'll add the other criteria that the committee came up with. But this was just our first initial, conversation or starters. These things will go up and down and the colors might change. Any initial feedback or thoughts or questions on any of these?
I have, Brian.
Yep.
Question. Your B6, that's the one you put in the river or the stream or whatever. Why is that more than the other 5 options when those are harder than a new school?
The construction cost is relatively the same as far as building the school. They're all in the low 90s. The added cost, we can go back and look at what we had carried, but the thought was field recreation afterwards is a little bit longer as far as the site work after it.
No, but the B6 cost you had, the net was 126 million. And the very first one was 118, 120, 122, 121, and it jumped up $5 million. I would assume the brand new school, you're not doing any reno and all of that, away from it would be cheaper.
The construction cost down below it, Jack, I think kind of represents the building cost. So from a building perspective, they're all relatively the same, except for the Johnson one's a little bit lower, because we think that the initial earthwork related to building the building was a little bit less on the Johnson site.
No, I understand that. I'm just going between all the bird options, just jumps up. And it seems like the ones you're doing the first 5 are harder to do than the last one, that's all.
I believe covered in the total cost is a field replication amount.
Yes.
Man, don't get me going on fields, because if you're gonna say you're gonna spend $7 million to do a field, time to rethink. But that was my question. Another question I have for Compass. When you do these 36, 40 months, I assume you factor in inflation to those numbers?
Yeah, we have escalation in the preliminary estimates.
Okay. Well, from what I do every day is once you get beyond the 2-year time frame, it's a crapshoot, and most guys are going to err on the side of caution. So the longer something is, you're going to pay that much more. So if you want me to give you a price today for a job that's not going to end for another almost 4 years, 3.5 years, you're going to pay a little higher price, only because, like, I just want to point that out to everybody there. A longer schedule, everybody's a little more hesitant in the future. 1.5 years, 2, everybody's pretty solid on that. That's all.
Right. So the longer construction duration project, when they bid that, Jack, I think is what you're saying, is that the bid numbers reflect there's a little bit more unknown, and they bid that maybe a little bit more padded than they would, hey, it's a solid 2-year project, I'm in and I'm out.
Yeah, most guys will lock in, your vendors will lock in stuff, but once you get beyond that, everybody, it's a, predict the future.
Right.
And I just wanted to point that out. And the other thing I want to point out to everybody, because I don't think anybody's involved in the high school, is one thing you got to consider. When we did the high school, that was like 3.5 years. So you're going to have a group of kids that's never seen anything other than dust, dirt, and all that. So that's another thing to be considered. It's almost like you stole those years away from them. That's a consideration I don't think a lot of times people consider. And if you look at Johnson, it doesn't take anything from anybody. Even the new one on Bird on the field doesn't. So that's something to consider, because I had 2 of my kids go through it. One for the whole duration, one for partial. And it does kind of knock it back a little. I don't know if it helped or hurt, but when you're there for that longer time, it's a problem when you're doing phase construction, add-ons, and all that. That's all.
Mr. Conroy, if I might add, and again, I've mentioned I teach at King Philip, we did a middle school project followed by a high school project, and there was a group of students that spent 5 years, some of them about 5.5 years, under construction. So that's a fair consideration.
How'd those kids turn out?
One of them teaches at the high school now, and the reason I bring this up is because she brings it up every now and then as not being a lot of fun. So
I thought you were going to tell me they're all contractors now.
Could be.
Ms. Lawson.
I am struck by this is the marvel of having this grid and laying it out in colors. I'm astonished at how much better the Johnson site looks as compared to the Bird sites, regardless of how I might feel. My kids went to Bird, and there's some emotional loyalty to that location, but it's sort of astonishing that the Johnson site comes up green in every category. This is a great grid. It's very helpful in analyzing a way forward. So thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Salvatore, you had a hand raised.
Okay, I have so the B6 the orange and the light greens and that, why do they exist? Why is that not just, if you just built on the fields, and first of all, I mean, take out the consideration of the paving the ball field, does that change the number of months substantially? And if you just put it on the site as it fits the best, does that change the costs and the other consideration and the time frame? And does B6 also include a phase in, because does it overlap with some of the other building site? And maybe there ought to be a plan that just puts the whole thing on that site at the least cost, and see what that looks like as a real option, rather than, this trying to protect a ball field. And frankly, everybody thinks that the field behind Bird, the baseball field where the varsity team plays, is a great field, but if you go look at the site, over the years, they keep adding dirt to the infield, and the infield's about 6 inches higher than the outfield. And it does slope down a little. So it's I don't know why we're protecting those fields, but is there if we were to just take that building and put it in its cheapest way on that site, would it look more green, more like the Johnson site?
Brian, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, I'll answer the one part though, David. So the B6 current option does include it does include phasing, because you tear the existing Bird down, maybe finalize the parking lot and the circulation, and it's including the duration of, yes, recreating at least one of the varsity fields out there, one of the full-size fields. There are currently 2, and a soccer field. It doesn't include recreating the softball field, or another ball field. There is a placeholder to create or replicate fields, possibly someplace else. And Chris, if you want to add to that.
Can we see that then? Can we see those numbers then without the consideration of the ball fields? And the other question, go ahead. I'll let you. I do have another comment, but go ahead with your.
I was just going to suggest that the B6 is, I think, the design team's opinion that is actually the least expensive option for this down on the fields, because the working group has tossed this around in multiple ways, and it has kept coming that if you have to put this thing, let's just say that the assumption is putting it in the middle of all of the fields, and then you lose all 3 of them, then you're just having, and the soccer, you're going to have to rebuild all of that somewhere else, because you already have a field crunch in town. And so
we're in the process of building fields, so that's why I'm just
so maybe someone from the working group should comment on that, but I'm just saying that B6 does represent what we've come to realize as probably the least expensive option to the total town cost. Take into consideration how many fields you're taking off.
Mr. Blunson, I believe he's speaking to what would the cost be if we did not consider the cost of replacing fields. Am I correct, Mr. Salvatore?
Yeah, I think if we could see that maybe B6 laid out, keeping in consideration, okay, yes, we're going to lose fields, and yes, we may have to replace them. Maybe take those numbers separately. And also, it's interesting that, so if we build at Johnson, we're going to have Bird, but we build at Johnson, we're not taking any consideration of demolishing Bird. So, it's just interesting that we ought to be looking at the cost of demolishing Bird if it's not, no matter what scenario we build.
I think the Johnson model includes demolition of at least one of the buildings, if I'm not mistaken. But I understand what you're saying, David. And that'd be a question if you're going to demolish that we would need a plan of what we're doing with the existing buildings. Is it to
Right.
demolish Bird and make that a parking lot, or add another field there for a field complex? I mean, that's not necessarily included in these options.
Right. These are just things I'd like to see before we make a final. Because if you were just to look at the colors, B6 just goes away, and that I think B6 deserves some more consideration than that. And I think if we can look at that.
Yeah. So the goal for tonight really is to get everyone's comments kind of on initial, like we're doing here. So some of the inputs, questions, comments about the criteria, and if we need to see some numbers a different way or something like that. And also, ideally, if there's a way to say, some of these options just don't work off the bat, and we can narrow this down a little bit more, that'd be great. But again, we want to make sure that everyone's comfortable with the options before you move forward. But for example, does a phase project, is that worth the longer duration and the hassle than maybe one of the new options where we're not touching the existing building or waiting for the existing building to come down? So that maybe that's one where it doesn't make sense to study it any further simply because of those criteria. Possibly does it make sense to look at the three new options on Bird, including the fields and the option in Johnson? Is add Reno in the phase project maybe not worth it? It's going to end up being longer and more expensive in the long run. That's just some of the things that we're throwing out there as a way to maybe streamline the process.
Mr. Schematic, please.
Yeah, so the B6 option to me is puzzling. Specifically because one of the discussions that we had in the previous meetings was regarding the elevation changes on some of the options that we initially had on the Bird site, where additional construction costs would come into play, and that's why we considered building it on a flat area, which were the fields, where you would save significant amount of moving dirt or anything like that. It's puzzling to me that cost is even higher than something we initially had. The second piece that I had on B6 is there an option to move B6 onto the other side where that field currently is? Because like Mr. Conroy said, I don't think it's wise to build something on a waterway. And obviously you're going to run into conservation issues there as well. So I don't know if that's a feasible option or not, but it just, I don't know, for me, from a cost standpoint, it just didn't make sense that's a $95 million construction cost, whereas some of the ones, especially B5, where you're talking about a whole story of elevation change, is actually $2 million cheaper.
Anybody else? Ms. Gallivan.
I agree with the people that are saying that we should separate out the costs of the fields as it relates to B6. I think it's a separate conversation. So I would suggest breaking out those costs. And I just want to be sure I understand the construction duration, where there's 36 parentheses 20 or 40 parentheses 20. Are we saying that the building takes 20 months in each case, but the total project would go on for either 36 or 40 months? Is that how that?
Yeah, that's correct, Nancy. So the number in parentheses is the duration for the building itself and the occupancy for students. The elongated next to it represents the total time for demo of the existing building and the subsequent site work that goes with that. So students will be able to occupy this particular option after 20 months, even though there will be construction continue on site for demo. Same in this case, and this case.
Yeah.
The building.
The only one that gets tweaked, should probably be tweaked a little bit, is and again, these are initial, very conceptual durations, but it's just a matter of which one we think is the fastest and which one might be the longest. And then B4, where you're actually building building in phases, you'd be able to occupy a portion of the building in 20 months, but you'd still have a remaining portion of the building to construct, another 9 or 12 months after that, and then finish up your site work. So, you could be into the 32 to 40 months range for the whole project.
Okay, that's
And those
what had me,
will tighten up, but that's the general idea, yes.
because that's what had me confused. When one of the cases was a gradual move into the building. So, because otherwise they look like that B1, B4, B5, and B6, and the Johnson one are all equal at 20 months for the kid, from the kid's point of view. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I just think we need to break out the fields. The fields we have to talk about for sure, but I think we should understand the cost of putting a building on the bird school site separate from the cost of the fields. Thank you.
We can do that.
From the children's perspective, I think that the Johnson is a nicer site to have the kids. They're going to have more exposure to woods. It's just more of like a neighborhood environment. I do not enjoy going to the back side of Bird, like the traffic there. So I'm a little surprised about some of these conversations when, at least from my end, I think the Johnson side is just, it will be more caring for the kids. And it's something that we have to take into consideration, where they're going to be spending 3 years of their life. It's a little bit more suburban, I guess, than the Bird side.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Mr. Jack Fisher, please.
Brian, I think this is really good, what you've started with. I think we all need to understand these are preliminary numbers. These are not close to being final numbers, and they're going to require a lot more work on them. But one of the things I just want to ask you to make sure that you do is that you make sure that we're comparing apples to apples across the different options. All right? In some cases, it seems that you may have included demolition costs, but in other cases you may not. So just do the same for every one. If you're going to include field replication costs in there, call it out, but make sure that it goes into the total number for each one, or it's called out so that we see it. It's really important that when we're doing the comparison on costs, that we're comparing apples to apples for the same end result. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Yeah, we can do that, Jack.
Mr. Conroy.
Okay, thank you. First off, Brian, how you doing? You got all the costs here, I understand, but as we know, just looking at it, Johnson has the less amount of non-reimbursable. So I don't like to deal with total. I like to deal with what I'm going to pay. So that's what you're going to have to, in my opinion, you got to break out is how much is what's the final number going to be to the town?
Yep. So Jeff Fisher had brought that up, so we're going to add that to the matrix. That'll be another line. And then obviously any of the options that have temporary swing space, they might have more site development or site work after the fact, if you're including redoing your field or not. That option might be more expensive from a site perspective. Obviously, we'll have to see where that compares to earth moving on a different site. And then you're right. So then those options have the potential to have less eligible dollars for reimbursement. And you're right. Right now, preliminarily, with what we know, I mean, the Johnson site, you'd seem to avoid as many temporary costs as you could, which would be deemed ineligible by the MSBA.
Okay, the other thing, Brian, that you can answer, Tony talked about the months, 40 months versus 20. Now, the 20 months is actual construction, but the contract will be on the site for, say, the 40 months.
Right, and that's kind of where it gets into that, why is one option maybe a little bit more expensive than another? So, for instance, if the B6 option is going to include doing a field on the site, they're on site while the field's happening. They're responsible for the field being established. The duration of the general contractor's work, so to speak, during demolition and parking lot creation, obviously is much longer, which drives up the cost, and that's why. While a new building out front that might have some more excavation costs, if it's done faster over the long period of time, it might be less expensive because the contractor's on site for a shorter duration.
Okay, yeah, I understand that. My last comment is, and it's not mine to decide, I'll stay in my sandbox, is I think the school committee needs to discuss what they think on what's better educational for them, because this will affect them. Do you want to be in dust and dirt for 3-4 years, or are you better off? That needs to come from them. That can't come from this committee. I do dollars and cents. I'm not living with this, and I think that's something that should be on the school committee's agenda to say what they feel is what's the best, or at least the path to the best.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy. That's a good point. Mr. Jarvis, do you have any final presentations or final items to speak to on item number 5?
No, I don't. I don't know if anyone else has any questions, and I don't know if there's any inkling to take any of these off the board if possible at this point.
I'd like one follow-up, just if I may.
Yes, Mr. Salvatore.
Just so if B6 were also to just be looked at as, no consideration, if it were just raw land, no consideration of the fields, where would you place that building? It seems like B6 is set out in order to try and preserve that field. I think we kind of need to see an option that doesn't consider even trying to preserve the field, because in trying to preserve the field, you end up into the area where there's a change in slope, and you also end up in an area where you have to worry about phasing the demolition of the bird school. So I think it ought to be looked at as if you just place it as much as you can on the flat on the East Street side, and just make that comparison with the other plans. I think the numbers would be at least more akin to what the Johnson numbers are, and I think then we can make a clear decision on that. And also and then we can consider the fact that we're losing a field, but that's in fact the field that you're preserving is not the high school field, though.
Hey, Mark, can I just Mark, this is Chris. Can I just make a comment?
Mr. Boston, if you could wait, I believe Mr. Fisher had a question as well.
If Chris was responding to Dave, I'll
okay, very good. Mr. Boston, if you could, please.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that there will not be any more rounds of estimating to clarify cost on any of these options until the end of the PSR, which is only going to include essentially the base station, the ad reno, and whatever your preferred new option is. And that's what's going to be estimated next. So there's not any more clarity as far as estimates for a new B6 design or something currently planned for this round of the development. So it's really, these numbers are really what we're working with at this point. So I just wanted to make sure that's, Brian, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's.
Yeah, I mean, what we can do is we can look at the construction costs. The B6 construction costs to me are not going to change. The building is the building, and the associated site work with the building is not going to change. The total project cost of field renovations that were carried, or any temporary swing spaces or anything like that, we could back that out. And then if there's anything that stood out of the existing estimate related to field replication and construction costs, we could possibly back that out too. But it's not like, Chris, we're not going to do a separate estimate at this point, but we could separate it out so you at least saw, like Jack said, apples to apples for those two options.
I get that. Thank you.
Mr. Fisher.
Sorry, I was just going to say the assumption on B6 too is that there is some field restoration at that site.
Yep.
So whether it's a softball field or a baseball field, there would be some work done on that field, so that at least the district has one field remaining.
Right, and then
I just wanted to expand on what Charlie just said, and also this backs up a little bit what Jack Fisher said. Right now, all of the B bird options, in some ways are apples to apples, because what's happening on the B6 site is, in order to get the same amount of fields that you would have at the end of the project for the other options, B6 is not just restoring this field, but it's also demolishing and rebuilding some type of soccer or some type of field space up here to replace what was taken in the outfields here. And Charlie and Chris can expand or correct me on that, but that's why I think you're seeing the number go up, because in order to have an apples to apples comparison of these three options, this
you have to have the
option,
fields.
this option leaves you with no field unless there's a field built here. If we want to consider just removing all the costs of field replication and replacement, it's not really an apples to apples comparison of these.
Yeah, because those existing options, the fields remain.
All the fields remain in use during the project and also after the project. And that's what the goal was here, is to have an apples to apples comparison. And that's why you see these numbers go up a little bit. And that's another reason why we just didn't plop it down anywhere based on simplicity. It's to preserve and to compare with these. I mean, we can do that. We could remove all the costs here related to replicating fields, but then I don't think you're comparing the finished product that you're going to get to these three here.
Well, if you can just break them out, that would be great. At least we can know what we're doing.
Yep.
Yeah, in the conceptual cost estimates, there are carried numbers for each of those.
Yeah, we can show total costs, and then another line could be, field replication or additional site costs, and fill in based on each option, and kind of get you to that point.
That'd be great.
Yeah, we can work on that.
So, Mr. Fisher, and then Ms. Lawson, if we could.
Yeah, so my comment really talks to total cost versus construction costs. And Brian, if you look at them, we're 26 million above construction costs to 31 million. If we look at Johnson, we're 26 million over construction costs. If you look at the ad reno, it's only 27 million, but we're talking about 3 phases, a year plus longer, modular classrooms, and it's only $1 million more. The numbers just don't seem to work for me.
Which one are you looking at, BR2, Jeff?
If you look at B2, any of the bird, right? Most of those are phased approaches, a lot longer construction duration, modular, just additional costs overall. And that's right in line with the additional costs of Johnson. You're at 26 million in additional costs on Johnson. You're only 27 million for BR2.
Right. I mean, in theory, you have a little bit less. I mean, the construction cost is a little bit lower on BR2, but you're also building and using some of that school earlier. So again, that option included building that new wing, kind of using that wing as swing space and limiting some of the swing space, the temporary swing space costs than some of the other options that we had talked about earlier, if that makes any sense. Like, some of that building is going to be online after year, 1.5, after year 2, after year 3. Like, you're not paying for the swing space as long. If that makes any sense. And you're reusing some of the existing site from a circulation perspective, and from a cost perspective, you're reusing some of that in the renovation.
Okay, I mean, I'll wait for the next round of seeing the numbers, but with all the additional costs beyond construction costs almost being identical within 5 million, it doesn't seem to take into consideration all the logistics for, the phased approaches versus.
Understood. So
we're done.
Ms. Lawson, if we could.
Before I make my comment, I just wanted to ask Jeff a question. So, Jeff, are you saying that the Johnson site seems to you overall to be the better approach?
I'm not at a point to make a decision yet. We're not far enough along.
Right, but
all
It
the
sounded
things
like
yet.
Jeff, you were
You know,
saying that.
the difference in the Johnson site and additional cost is $26 million. I'm finding it hard to believe that an ad reno and a project taking almost twice as long is only $1 million more on additional costs.
The point I wanted to make was about the fields, and I think I don't want us to confuse the idea of recreational fields and preserving the fields at Bird, if that's the site we use for recreation, because there's an educational component to those fields. I mean, there's physical education, and we have to have fields so that the kids can enjoy those programs as part of their education. So it's not just, oh, we need more fields. Part of the educational program in a middle school is that students do have physical education and need access to fields. So we have to have fields at whatever site we end up with, whether it's Johnson or Bird. That was the only point I was making.
Thank you, Ms. Lawson. Mr. Jarvis, any final slides for item 5? Mr. Jarvis, pardon me.
No, I think that's all we have to present for item 5.
Do we have any final questions or comments on item 5? So we have a lot to think about, I guess. So item 6, if we could, is to review the project dashboard and to vote on the November vendor invoice package. Mr. Jarvis.
Sorry, Mark. Yeah, we can do this, but we need to come back to schedule as far as when we want to meet again, because we have to make some decisions in the interim.
Okay.
So yeah, project dashboard, this went out in your package before the meeting. This was the update as of the end of November, obviously highlighting the PDP submission. Everything is on budget, no major issues at this point. Next slide, Tony. And budget update inclusive of the two invoices you see on the lower right of your screen, the Compass invoice for $15,781.25 and Chap A's invoice for $36,250 for a total of $52,031.25 are up for vote and approval tonight. And the budget snapshot is above that, which would be inclusive of approving those invoices. And then the MSBA reimbursement to date, we've done 2 payment requests. The first one was processed. The second one was, I believe, received back in the middle of November. So the town has received just over 58,000 in reimbursements back so far. Any questions on any of those? We'll need a vote on the invoices.
Mr. Fisher.
Ed, what's the ineligible project cost for the MSBA submission for September 4th?
They kicked out some of the educational visioning that we had done with David Stevens, because we had started that before the designer was officially on board. They actually allowed us to claim some additional costs there as eligible out of his $16,000, but we kind of knew that going in, and that's just the way their policy is, but it helped us get a jump start on it when the staff was available.
Thank you.
So do we have a motion to accept or approve the vendor invoice package?
I'll make a motion to approve.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second from Mrs. Gallivan. Dr. Goff, your vote?
Yes.
Ms. Gallivan, your vote?
Yes.
Ms. Lawson?
Yes.
Mr. Senek?
Yes.
Very good. Mr. Jack Fisher?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Santiago Taylor?
Yes.
Mr. Hahn?
Yes.
Mr. Fisher?
Yes.
Mr. Jeffrey Fisher?
Yes.
Ms. Gaositz?
Yes.
And Mr. Conroy?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Donnie.
Mr. Salvatore? Very good, Mr. Anderson. Thank you. Mr. Salvatore?
Yes.
Very good. It is a vote. And so, Mr. Jarvis, you said, do we need to consider the calendar here?
Yeah, so upcoming for the PSR stage, obviously we're meeting tonight on the 15th for the enrollment decision. As I mentioned earlier, in order to get enough running room to finalize the preferred solution, do an updated estimate, and get that to the MSBA by the end of February, we're looking for the building committee to vote on a final submission, preferred schematic report to the MSBA on the February 23rd meeting. So that means we'll be assembling that package all through early February, which means we really need a decision on the option to move forward with by the end of January. I think we had targeted January 20th and a couple invites after last meeting for that building committee meeting to happen. But in working with the working group and discussing it, we think it would make sense to have, we talked about doing another community forum to let people know kind of where we are, what options we were moving forward with, et cetera. And we think it'd be better to have that community forum prior to that building committee to allow people to understand the options that we are considering and maybe to get some feedback, especially if we're talking about a Johnson versus a Byrd site. And then meet with this committee at the end of January to make a decision on, okay, this is the one option that we want to move forward with. I guess my first question is, does 126 work for this committee to meet? I know there's a Board of Selectmen meeting that night, but if we started at 6, or if we started earlier at 5:30, I'm not sure if that works, or if there's a different day that week. And then my second question is, obviously we have a lot of work to do between now and that final decision. So having a meeting in between there to come back with some of that updated information, an updated matrix with a couple lines on it that maybe starts to whittle away at some of these options and, you know, build other options up. We probably want to meet early January to go through that information to allow a couple weeks to then digest that before making a final decision. So the first week of January, the week of the 4th, any days work for this committee for that meeting?
Brian, I'll suggest, we've been meeting on Tuesdays all along. I'd like to suggest we continue meeting on Tuesdays.
So Tuesday the 5th?
Yeah.
How long do you think it'll be? It's a religious holiday for me, the 5th to the 6th, but I can make some of it. How long do you think the meeting will be?
I think if we won't have any of the other administrative stuff tonight, but we'll just focus on the updated options. So, I mean, an hour and 50.
I do that.
All right, so does the 5th work for everyone?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, we'll go with that for an update. And then does the 26th work for everyone, as far as that's the night that we are going to ask you to vote on the preferred option and narrow it down to 1?
Are you sure, Brian, are you sure that you can get everything prepared by the 26th?
We're going to have a lot of it prepared for the 5th. And then it's going to be really, our goal is to have all that prepared for the 5th. So you have a couple weeks to think about it and digest it, and then come to the meeting on the 26th with which way you want to go. So yes, Jack, we have to in order to meet the schedule.
Any questions or comments about those dates? So that works for everybody? Very good.
That works. I would just suggest that if, as people review them, as who would they contact, or who would I contact as I'm looking at it to save time at the meeting early on to get some clarifications or issues, you know, perhaps.
You can email us, David, Brian, and Tony, and Chris, or we're all copied on the info that goes out to you.
Yeah, it might just speed up the meeting if there's just some quick questions that people have.
And that's in general for folks. I mean, you don't have to wait for the meeting if you have questions. If you're thinking of something while you're working on it on a weekend, shoot us an email, and we can at least, you know, I would copy Mark just so he's aware, and then we can work on getting responses back to you in real time.
And honestly, just so you know, if I send something on a Saturday afternoon, I don't expect an answer till Monday or Tuesday. So don't be like, okay. just you know, that's when I get to this stuff. And sometimes people answer, I'm like, no, you could have waited till Monday. So
okay, that's good to know. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any final questions or comments?
I'm good. Tony, anything else?
No, I'm just confirming the meeting for 1/5, 1/26, and 2/26. And I'll send out Outlook calendar invites for people to either respond to or just have as a placeholder in their calendar. And I just want to remind the project team that we switched these dates here. So we're going to be shooting for that community forum on the 20th, which we can discuss after the holiday.
Thanks.
Good. So at this point, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Mrs. Gallivan, we have a motion, and Mr. Conroy is a second. Need to poll the committee. Dr. Goff?
Yes.
I vote yes. Ms. Gallivan?
Yes.
Ms. Lawson?
Yes.
Mr. Sedek?
Yes.
Jack Fisher?
Yes.
Mr. Connor?
Yes.
Ms. Santiago Taylor?
Yes.
Mr. Hahn?
Yes.
Mr. Fisher?
Yes.
Mr. Frisha?
Yes.
Ms. Gaositz?
Yes.
Mr. Conroy?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
And Mr. Salvatore?
Yes.
All right, it is a vote. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night now.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, everybody. This was a lot of good work.
Good night.